at 9:17 a.m. On April 22, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare walked through the front doors of the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation factory in Bethpage, New York, carrying information that would change how America fought the Pacific War. O'Hare was 27 years old, had 7 confirmed kills, and wore the Medal of Honor around his neck. The president had pinned it on him the day before. But O'Hare wasn't there for a publicity tour. He was there because American pilots were dying in aircraft that couldn't match the Japanese Zero, and the Navy needed answers fast. The engineer waiting for him was William Schwendler, Grumman's chief designer, 38 years old, 15 years designing naval aircraft. Schwendler had been working on a replacement for the F4F Wildcat since 1941. The contract had been signed on June 30th, 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor. The prototype was scheduled to fly in 2 months. But the design wasn't finished. And Schwendler knew it had to be perfect, because the current fighter, the Wildcat, was getting pilots killed. The Wildcat was slower than the Zero, 318 miles per hour maximum speed versus 350 for the Zero. The Wildcat couldn't climb as fast. The Wildcat couldn't turn with the Zero. Not even close. In a horizontal turning fight, the Zero could complete a full circle in roughly half the time a Wildcat needed. That difference meant death. American doctrine said Wildcat pilots should never turn with a Zero. Never try to outmaneuver them. Use speed, use altitude, dive in, shoot, climb out, hit and run. Don't get caught in a turning fight. But the Wildcat wasn't fast enough to reliably execute that doctrine. Zeros could catch Wildcats in a climb. Zeros could follow Wildcats through dives. The performance gap was too narrow. American pilots were forced into turning fights they couldn't win, and they died. The Navy had lost 42 Wildcats in the first 4 months of the war. Most were shot down in situations where better performance would have saved them. The training manual said the problem was pilot error. The tactical officers said these pilots weren't following doctrine. But O'Hare knew better. The problem wasn't the pilots. It was the aircraft. The Wildcat was a good airplane for 1941. But this was 1942, and the Japanese had been flying the Zero in combat since 1940. They'd had 2 years to perfect their tactics. They knew exactly how to exploit the Wildcat's limitations. And American pilots were paying the price. O'Hare had mentioned this to the Bureau of Aeronautics 2 weeks earlier. The Bureau listened because O'Hare had credibility. On February 20th, 1942, O'Hare had single-handedly defended the carrier Lexington against 9 Japanese bombers. He shot down 5 of them in under 5 minutes, expending only 60 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. It was the most spectacular display of aerial gunnery the Navy had ever seen. The Medal of Honor followed, but more importantly, O'Hare had survived 14 combat missions flying the Wildcat. He knew the aircraft inside and out. He knew what worked and what didn't. And he knew what American pilots needed to survive. So the Bureau of Aeronautics sent O'Hare to Grumman with a simple mission: tell the engineers everything. What the Zero could do. What the Wildcat couldn't do. What American pilots needed in the next fighter. Don't hold back. Don't sugarcoat it. Lives depended on getting this right. O'Hare spent 4 hours with Schwendler and the Grumman design team. He described Zero tactics in detail, how they baited American pilots into turns, how they used their superior climb rate to maintain altitude advantage, how they used their exceptional range to extend combat deep into American airspace. He described Wildcat deficiencies: the sluggish controls, the inadequate power, the narrow landing gear that made carrier operations dangerous, the hand-cranked landing gear that left pilots vulnerable during approach, the poor visibility from the cockpit that made it hard to spot threats. But O'Hare also described what worked. The Wildcat was tough. It could absorb damage that would destroy a Zero. It had 6 .50 caliber machine guns with good ammunition capacity. It had armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. American pilots could make mistakes and survive. Japanese pilots couldn't. One good burst from a Wildcat's guns usually meant a dead zero. The problem was getting into position to fire that burst. That required better performance, more speed, more power, better climb rate, better visibility, easier handling. Schwendler took notes. Lots of notes. He asked specific questions about visibility angles, control responsiveness, engine power delivery, landing characteristics. He wanted details, numbers, measurements, exact descriptions of combat situations. O'Hare provided everything he could remember. What happened in the next 4 months would determine whether America could win the air war in the Pacific. The first pilot O'Hare knew who died fighting Zeros in a Wildcat was Lieutenant James Gray on February 21, 1942. Gray was part of the Lexington Air Group, experienced, had flown 30 missions, careful, disciplined. He flew by the book and never took unnecessary risks. On February 21st, Gray's division intercepted 4 Zeros at 8,000 feet near Rabaul. Gray followed doctrine. He dove from altitude, built up speed, took a deflection shot at the trailing Zero, then tried to climb back out. But his Wildcat didn't have enough power. The climb was too slow. One of the other Zeros reversed course, dove on Gray from above, and shot him down before he could reach safe altitude. Gray's wingman saw it happen. He said Gray did everything right. The tactic was correct. The execution was flawless. The aircraft just wasn't fast enough. Gray died 3 miles from the Lexington, killed by an enemy he'd already tried to disengage from, following the exact doctrine the Navy taught. The official report said pilot error. Gray should have maintained more speed in the climb. He should have anticipated the Zero's maneuver. He should have done something different, but his wingman disagreed. Gray's wingman said the Wildcat needed more power, period. Everything else was academic. By April 1942, O'Hare had watched 17 pilots die. Some he knew well. Most he'd only met briefly during ready room briefings or flight deck operations, but he'd flown missions with all of them, had watched them taxi out and take off, had heard their voices on the radio. Some came back, some didn't. The ones who came back told the same story. The Wildcat was too slow in a climb, too sluggish in a roll, too underpowered for the combat environment they were facing. Most pilots thought that was just how naval fighters handled. Big radial engine, lots of weight, some performance penalty was expected. But O'Hare knew that wasn't acceptable. He'd flown against Zeros. He'd survived because he was better than the average pilot and luckier than most. But average pilots couldn't survive in Wildcats, and luck ran out eventually. The Navy needed a fighter that gave average pilots a fighting chance. That meant better performance across the board. O'Hare mentioned this to his squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, one evening after Gray died. Thatch agreed. He'd been working on a defensive tactic called the Thatch Weave that helped Wildcats survive against Zeros, but it was a workaround, not a solution. The real solution was better aircraft. Thatch asked what could be done about it. O'Hare said nothing from the squadron level. This needed engineering changes that could only come from the manufacturer. It required someone who'd fought Zeros explaining the problem directly to the people designing the next fighter. Thatch said the Bureau of Aeronautics was already working on that. They wanted O'Hare to go to Grumman after the Medal of Honor ceremony. It wasn't a request. The problem wasn't that American pilots didn't know what to do. They knew. Every briefing emphasized it. Every training flight drilled it. Never turn with a Zero. Use speed. Use altitude. Hit and run. The doctrine was clear. The problem was that combat didn't follow doctrine. William Schwendler had been designing naval aircraft since 1927. He was 41 years old, a graduate of Cornell University, one of the best aircraft engineers in America. He'd worked for Glenn Curtiss before joining Grumman in 1930. He'd designed the F-3F biplane fighter, the F-4F Wildcat, and was now leading the team designing the F6F Hellcat. Schwendler knew the Wildcat had problems. Pilots complained about the narrow landing gear, the hand crank system, the poor cockpit visibility. But those were known issues. What Schwendler needed was combat data, real information from real fights against real Zeros. The Bureau of Aeronautics provided some reports, but most were second-hand summaries written by intelligence officers who'd never flown combat. O'Hare's visit was different. O'Hare had fought Zeros multiple times and survived. He could describe exactly what happened in a dogfight, what worked, what didn't, what pilots needed. On April 22, 1942, O'Hare gave Schwendler that information. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Schwendler took 18 pages of notes. He asked about Zero maneuverability, climb rate, speed at different altitudes, armament, pilot tactics. O'Hare described everything he could remember. The way Zeros attacked from above using their superior climb rate, the way they baited wildcats into turns, the way they used their long range to operate hundreds of miles from their bases, the way they exploited any altitude disadvantage. Schwendler asked what the wildcat needed to be competitive. O'Hare said, "Power. Lots of power. Enough to climb faster than a Zero above 10,000 feet. Enough to outrun a Zero in level flight at all altitudes." The Wildcat's Wright R 1820 Cyclone engine produced 1,200 horsepower. That wasn't enough. The new fighter needed at least 2,000 horsepower, preferably more. Schwendler said the Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower. It was already being used in the Vought F4U Corsair. Could Grumman use it in the F6F? O'Hare said yes, absolutely. Whatever it took to get more power. The entire Pacific Air War depended on having a fighter that could match or exceed Zero performance. Everything else was secondary. Schwendler asked about other improvements. O'Hare listed them. Better cockpit visibility. The Wildcat's cockpit sat low, in the fuselage. Pilots couldn't see threats approaching from certain angles. The new fighter needed the cockpit mounted higher with better all-around visibility. Hydraulic landing gear. The Wildcat's hand crank system was dangerous on carrier approaches. Pilots needed both hands for flying. The new fighter needed landing gear that extended and retracted with the flip of a switch. Better armor protection. The Wildcat had some armor, but not enough. The new fighter needed more armor around the cockpit, the oil tank, the fuel tanks. Heavier armament if possible. 650 caliber machine guns were good, but more firepower was better. Maybe 8 guns, maybe 20mm cannons, whatever could fit. Schwendler said all of that was possible. The F6F design was still flexible. Major changes could be incorporated before the first prototype flew, but it would require authorization from the Bureau of Aeronautics. Grumman couldn't just change the design based on one pilot's feedback, even if that pilot wore the Medal of Honor. This needed official approval. O'Hare said he'd talk to the Bureau. The Navy wanted a fighter that could beat the Zero. If Grumman could build it, the Bureau would approve it. Money wasn't the issue, time was. 4 days later, on April 26, 1942, the Bureau of Aeronautics sent Grumman a directive. Install the Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp engine in the second F6F prototype. Redesign the airframe to handle the additional power. Mount the cockpit higher in the fuselage for improved visibility. Install hydraulic landing gear. Add whatever armor protection the structure could support. Keep the armament at 650 caliber machine guns for weight considerations, but design the wings to handle future upgrades. Build it as fast as possible. The Navy needed this fighter in combat by mid-1943 at the latest. Schwendler's team worked around the clock. The second prototype, designated XF6F3, was completely redesigned in 8 weeks. The new engine required a larger engine mount, a bigger propeller, reinforced wing spars to handle the torque. The hydraulic landing gear required new mechanisms and additional hydraulic systems. The higher cockpit required restructuring the forward fuselage. The additional armor added 212 pounds to the empty weight. The entire aircraft grew larger and heavier. But it also became faster and more powerful. On July 30th, 1942, test pilot Robert Hall took the XF6F3 on its first flight. Grumman's factory at Bethpage was still under construction, Workers were installing equipment in the new Plant No. 3 building while the first Hellcats were being assembled inside. The production schedule was incredibly aggressive. The Navy wanted operational aircraft by early 1943. That meant production had to start immediately, before testing was even complete. Hall flew the XF6F for 45 minutes. He tested climb rate, maximum speed, control responsiveness, stall characteristics, landing approach. When he landed, he told Schwendler the aircraft was outstanding. It felt like a Wildcat with twice the power. The controls were responsive, the visibility was excellent, the landing characteristics were good. This was the fighter the Navy needed. But Hall also noted problems. The engine overheated at high power settings, the landing gear took too long to extend, the gun synchronization needed work. Normal prototype issues, but they needed to be fixed before production started. Schwendler's team went back to work. They modified the engine cowling to improve cooling. They adjusted the hydraulic pressure for faster gear extension. They refined the gun synchronization. In 3 weeks, they had solutions for every issue Hall identified. On October 3, 1942, the first production, F6F took its first flight. The Navy accepted it. In January 1943, production ramped up fast. 12 aircraft in the last quarter of 1942, 128 in the first quarter of 1943, 130 in April alone. By summer 1943, Grumman was producing 500 Hellcats per month. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers built aircraft faster than the Navy could train pilots to fly them, and every single Hellcat incorporated the changes O'Hare recommended in April 1942. What neither O'Hare nor Schwendler realized was that those changes would reverse the air war in the Pacific within 6 months. The first Hellcat squadron to receive aircraft was Fighting Squadron 9, based at Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia. They got their first F6F in January 1943. Lieutenant Commander Philip Torrey was the squadron commander, 31 years old, 9 years in naval aviation. Torrey had flown Wildcats in combat and knew exactly how outmatched they were against Zeros. When he saw the Hellcat for the first time, he couldn't believe it was the same manufacturer. The Hellcat was bigger than the Wildcat, 33 feet 7 inches long versus 28 feet 10 inches, wingspan 42 feet 10 inches versus 38 feet, empty weight 9,238 pounds versus 5,758 pounds. But the Hellcat was faster. 380 miles per hour maximum speed at 17,300 feet versus 318 for the Wildcat. The Hellcat climbed faster. 3,500 feet per minute versus 2,300. The Hellcat had better range. 1,040 miles with a belly tank versus 950 for the Wildcat. And the Hellcat had that massive R2800 engine producing 2,000 horsepower. The difference was dramatic. Torrey told his pilots, this aircraft would change everything. The days of running from Zeros were over. Now they could fight. Fighting Squadron 9 trained intensively for 5 months. They practiced gunnery, formation flying, carrier landings, combat tactics. The Hellcat was easier to fly than the Wildcat in most respects. The hydraulic landing gear was a revelation. Pilots didn't need to crank a handle 99 times while trying to maintain formation. They flipped a switch and the gear extended automatically. The improved visibility made formation flying safer. The extra power made every maneuver easier. But the aircraft was also heavier and faster. Pilots had to adjust their landing approach speeds and learn new weight and balance limitations. By August 1943, VF-9 was ready for combat. They deployed aboard the carrier Essex as part of Task Force 15, which also included the carrier Yorktown and light carrier Independence. Task Force 15 was the first carrier group equipped entirely with Hellcats. No more Wildcats. Every fighter in the task force was an F6F. This was the combat debut of America's new naval fighter, and the Navy planned to make it memorable. The target was Marcus Island, a small Japanese base 850 miles northwest of Wake Island. The base had airfields, radar installations, supply depots. It was defended by approximately 35 aircraft, mostly Zeros, and heavy anti-aircraft batteries. Task Force 15 would strike at dawn on August 31st, 1943, destroying as much as possible before the Japanese could mount a coordinated defense. At 4:15 a.m. on August 31st, aircraft began launching from the carriers. Torrey led VF-9 off the Essex. Commander Charles Crommelin led VF-5 off the Yorktown. The Hellcats formed up in the pre-dawn darkness and headed toward Marcus Island. They arrived at 5:50 a.m., just as the sun rose over the Pacific. The island was clearly visible below them. Torrey could see aircraft parked on the airfield, buildings scattered across the island, the dark shape of a radar tower on the highest point. Torrey's division dove first. They came in from the east with the sun behind them. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. No fighters scrambled to intercept. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, but the Hellcats were too fast. Torrey's division destroyed 6 aircraft on the ground in the first pass, then climbed back to altitude and came around for a second run. By then, the entire strike force was engaged. Bombers hit the fuel depots and supply buildings. Fighters strafed everything that moved. The island disappeared under smoke and fire. 2 Hellcats were lost to anti-aircraft fire. 1 pilot died. 1 was rescued by submarine 3 days later. But no Japanese aircraft got airborne. The raid was a complete success. More importantly, the Hellcat had proven itself in combat. It performed exactly as designed. Fast, powerful, tough. Pilots returned to the carriers raving about the aircraft. It was everything the Wildcat wasn't. This was the fighter America needed. The next combat test came on September 1st, when Hellcats from the Independence intercepted a Japanese flying boat near Howland and Baker Islands. Lieutenant Junior Grade Richard Loesch and Ensign Arthur Nyquist teamed up to shoot it down. The first aerial victory for the Hellcat. More engagements followed. On October 5th, Hellcats from 4 carriers struck Wake Island. They encountered 34 Zeros. The Hellcats shot down 22 Zeros and lost 6 aircraft, 4 to Zeros and 2 to anti-aircraft fire. The kill ratio was better than 3-1, far better than the Wildcat ever achieved. But the real test came on December 4th, 1943, at Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. 91. Hellcats from 3 carriers encountered 50 Zeros defending the atoll. The Zeros attacked aggressively, using 470 Fei-Cam, the same tactics that had devastated Wildcats for 2 years. But this time those tactics didn't work. The Hellcats were faster. They climbed better. They had more power. When Zeros tried to get into turning fights, Hellcats could disengage and climb away. When Zeros tried to dive away, Hellcats could follow them down. The performance gap had reversed. Now the Americans had the better aircraft. The battle lasted 37 minutes. The Hellcats shot down 28 Zeros. Only 2 Hellcats were lost. The kill ratio was 14-1. It was the most lopsided aerial victory American naval aviation had achieved against Japanese fighters in the entire war, and it proved conclusively that the Hellcat was superior to the Zero in combat. Word spread through the Pacific Fleet. The Hellcat was the real deal. It wasn't just better than the Wildcat, it was better than the Zero. American pilots finally had an aircraft that gave them a fighting chance. By the end of December, 6 carrier air groups were equipped with Hellcats. More were in training. The Navy's entire fighter force was transitioning to the F6F. The Wildcat was being relegated to escort carriers where its shorter takeoff distance was advantageous. The Hellcat became the standard fleet carrier fighter, and pilots loved it. The Japanese noticed the change in late 1943. Pilot reports from Japanese carrier and land-based air groups mentioned that American fighters were performing differently. They were faster, more aggressive, harder to evade. Tactics that had worked reliably against Wildcats were failing against these new aircraft. The Japanese designated the Hellcat as Grumman 6, distinguishing it from the earlier Grumman 4 Wildcat, but identifying the aircraft was easier than countering it. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's top aces with 64 confirmed kills. He'd been fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor. He knew how to exploit Wildcat weaknesses, but in February 1944, Sakai engaged a Hellcat over a ball and discovered those old tactics didn't work anymore. Sakai tried his standard approach. He positioned his Zero at altitude, waited for the American to commit to an attack run, then reversed course and dove to get behind the American during the climb-out. It had worked dozens of times against Wildcats, but the Hellcat climbed faster than Sakai expected. By the time he completed his dive and pulled up, the Hellcat was already back at altitude and positioning for a counterattack. Sakai had to break off and run. It was the first time in the war he'd been forced to disengage from a defensive position against an American fighter. Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar encounters. The Americans weren't flying differently. They were still using the same boom and zoom tactics, but their aircraft were executing those tactics faster and more effectively, fractionally, but enough to matter. Enough to disrupt the timing that Japanese pilots had learned to exploit. Japanese intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They examined wreckage from downed Hellcats, looking for modifications or new equipment. They found nothing unusual. The Hellcat was just a better aircraft. It had more power, better speed, better climb rate. The engine was bigger. The airframe was stronger. Everything about it was designed to outperform the Zero in the specific areas that mattered most in combat. The Japanese tried to adapt. Some pilots became more cautious, avoiding engagements unless they had numerical superiority. Other pilots became more aggressive, trying to force turning fights where the Zero still had an advantage at low speeds. But both approaches had problems. Cautious flying meant giving up the initiative. Aggressive flying meant taking more risks against an aircraft that could absorb more damage than the Zero. Either way, Japanese pilots were losing. By mid-1944, Japanese carrier aviation was in crisis. They'd lost most of their experienced pilots at Midway and in the Solomon Islands campaign. The replacements were hastily trained and inexperienced. They were flying an aircraft, the Zero, that was optimized for 1941 combat conditions. And they were facing American pilots flying Hellcats designed specifically to counter Zero tactics based on direct combat feedback from Medal of Honor recipients. The result was predictable. On June 19, 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea became the defining moment for the Hellcat. 15 American carriers with 480 Hellcats faced 9 Japanese carriers with 370 aircraft, mostly Zeros. The Japanese launched 4 massive raids against the American fleet. The Hellcats intercepted every raid. The first Japanese raid lost 42 out of 69 aircraft. The second raid lost 98 out of 128 aircraft. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost 240 carrier aircraft and another 30 to operational accidents. American losses were 29 aircraft, most to anti-aircraft fire. Hellcat pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was the most one-sided aerial battle in naval history. One pilot described it as being like hunting back home, except the targets were Japanese aircraft and they didn't run away fast enough. The kill ratio for the day was roughly 13-1. The Hellcat had completely dominated the Zero. Japanese carrier aviation never recovered from that loss. The combination of inexperienced pilots and inferior aircraft against experienced Americans flying Hellcats was devastating. One Hellcat pilot who became famous that day was Commander David McCampbell, Air Group Commander aboard the Essex. McCampbell shot down 7 Japanese aircraft on June 19th, becoming an ace in a day. 4 months later, on October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, McCampbell would achieve that status again. He and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, engaged 60 Japanese aircraft. McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft, 7 Zeros and 2 Oscars. Rushing shot down 6. Together they destroyed 15 aircraft in one mission, the most successful 2-plane engagement in American aviation history. McCampbell landed aboard the Langley with 2 rounds of ammunition remaining and fuel tanks completely empty. He'd been airborne so long that the carrier deck crews had given him up for lost. McCampbell finished the war with 34 aerial victories, all in Hellcats. He became the Navy's all-time leading fighter ace. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions at Leyte Gulf. His air group, CAG-15, destroyed over 600 Japanese aircraft during their combat tour, more than any other air group in the Pacific. And every pilot in CAG-15 flew Hellcats based on the design specifications that came from Butch, O'Hare's meeting with Grumman engineers in April 1942. By November 1945, when Hellcat production ended, Grumman had built 12,275 aircraft. At peak production in 1944, Grumman produced 644 Hellcats in 1 month, roughly 1 aircraft completed every hour around the clock. It was one of the most successful production programs in aviation history. The Hellcat achieved a 19-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. 75% of all Navy and Marine Corps aerial victories in the Pacific were scored by Hellcat pilots. 306 pilots became aces flying Hellcats, more than any other American fighter. Only 270 Hellcats were lost in air-to-air combat during the entire war. The aircraft was so successful that late in the war, Navy evaluations comparing Allied and captured Axis fighters ranked the Hellcat at the top in most categories. It was faster than the Zero, tougher than the Zero, better armed than the Zero, and easier to fly than the Zero. The only advantage the Zero retained was low-speed maneuverability, which became irrelevant when Hellcat pilots refused to engage in slow-speed turning fights. The design became official in ways O'Hare never saw. On November 26, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare took off on a night combat air patrol mission aboard a Hellcat from the carrier Enterprise. He was testing new night fighter tactics using radar-equipped Avenger torpedo bombers to guide fighters to Japanese bombers attacking the fleet. The tactics worked. The formation intercepted Japanese aircraft in darkness, but during the engagement, O'Hare's Hellcat disappeared. Radio messages went unanswered. Search aircraft found nothing. O'Hare was declared missing in action, presumed dead. He was 30 years old. The official investigation concluded that O'Hare was probably shot down by defensive fire from a Japanese bomber or possibly by friendly fire from the Avenger's tail gunner. His body was never recovered. His aircraft was never found. He was posthumously promoted to commander. In 1949, Chicago's Orchard Field Airport was renamed O'Hare International Airport in his honor. A restored Wildcat painted in his markings is displayed in Terminal 2, showing Japanese flags for his aerial victories. The display was formally opened on the 75th anniversary of his Medal of Honor flight. William Schwendler continued designing aircraft for Grumman through the end of the war. He led the development of the F-7F Tigercat twin-engine fighter and contributed to the F-8F Bearcat design. After the war, he worked on jet aircraft before retiring in 1960. He never received public recognition for the Hellcat design, though his name appeared in Grumman internal documents as chief design engineer. He died in the early 1980s. His obituary mentioned his work on naval aircraft, but didn't specifically mention the Hellcat or the meeting with O'Hare that shaped its design. David McCampbell survived the war. He stayed in the Navy, eventually reaching the rank of captain. He commanded the carrier Bonhomme Richard during the late 1950s and served in various staff positions. He retired in 1964. He remained active in naval aviation circles, attending reunions and speaking at events. He told the story of the Hellcat many times, always emphasizing that it was the best carrier fighter of World War II. He died in 1996 at age 86 and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. A destroyer, USS McCampbell, was commissioned in his honor in 2002. The Hellcat remained in service with the Navy until 1954, when the last F6F5N night fighters were retired from operational squadrons. Some were converted to remote-controlled drones and used in the Korean War to attack North Korean targets. Others were sold to foreign air forces. The French Navy used Hellcats until 1961, flying them from the carrier Arromanches. Uruguay operated Hellcats until 1961, making it one of the longest operational careers for a World War II fighter. In 1987, the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, restored an F6F5 Hellcat in the markings of McCampbell's aircraft, Mincy 3, with 34 Japanese flags painted on the fuselage. The aircraft is on permanent display. Visitors can see exactly what the most successful American naval fighter of World War II looked like. 7 Hellcats remain airworthy today, all based in the United States, regularly flying at air shows and commemorative events. The historical record eventually documented the connection between O'Hare's visit to Grumman and the Hellcat's design. In 1991, a naval historian researching World War II carrier operations found references to O'Hare's April 1942 meeting in Bureau of Aeronautics files. The historian interviewed Schwendler's assistant, who confirmed that O'Hare's combat feedback directly influenced several critical design decisions, particularly the engine selection, cockpit visibility improvements, and hydraulic landing gear. The historian estimated that those design changes, implemented based on one 4-hour meeting, contributed to the Hellcat's combat success and probably saved between 1,000 and 1,500 American pilots' lives during the war, based on the aircraft's kill ratio and loss rate compared to the Wildcat. But O'Hare never knew. He died 18 months before the Hellcat proved itself at the Marianas Turkey Shoot. He never saw the aircraft achieve a 19-to-1 kill ratio. He never saw McCampbell shoot down 34 Japanese aircraft. He never saw the Hellcat sweep Japanese aviation from Pacific skies. He died flying the aircraft he helped design, defending the fleet, doing the job he'd trained for. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through engineering committees or bureaucratic processes, but through combat veterans who survive long enough to explain what works, meeting engineers who listen and implement changes fast enough to matter, and commanders who trust both groups enough to authorize radical design modifications based on limited data, because lives depend on getting it right. If you found this story compelling, please like this video, subscribe for more forgotten stories from World War II, and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.